When we think of Times Square, we think about all the great marvels of mankind. Almost all achievements that mankind has accomplished are presented to us in one way or another in Times Square. Times Square is seen as a major intersection and major entertainment hub, but Times Square represents more than that. It represents the fact that we are living in the most prosperous, advanced, enlightened, and accessible society ever seen in human history. 4D technology makes billboards seem more real than ever. Times Square was renamed Times Square in 1904. Originally, it was called Long A Square. Imagine explaining to a person living at the start of the 20th century what Times Square will look like in the 21st century. This is why Times Square has become a giant monolith that draws millions of people here every year, especially at the start of the new year, as the annual New Year's Eve ball drop takes place here every year. It is estimated that almost 500,000 pedestrians walk through Times Square daily. One man would maliciously take note of 500,000 people that walk through Times Square every day. On May 18, 2017, a man got in his 2009 Honda Accord. At 10:30, he would leave his apartment, and at 11:54, he would be caught on camera making a U-turn and driving on the sidewalk for 3 blocks straight. He would drive on 7th Avenue and 42nd Street and continue running over people until crashing into traffic billboards on 7th Avenue and 45th Street. The man would then proceed to get out of his car and start to scream and yell while attacking random pedestrians. He would eventually be subdued and arrested. Once his rampage was over, it would end up taking the life of one person and severely injuring 20 people. During the attack, several people reported the attack to 911.
Times Square, Sergeant.
Times Square, Sergeant.
Sergeant, we got a car running people over, 42 and 7. 42 and 7.
Detroit Chevrolet with a car running people over, okay?
Going northbound on 7th Avenue Central, running people over.
Do you have a plate of color?
Show me response. South Sergeant, show me response.
For what kind of car is it?
What kind of car is this? Red, Honda Accord, red 4-door car. Unknown plate at this time. Right here, we have multiple people injured. Need a level 1 at this location, sir.
Task force, stand by.
All over city side. Notify everyone, Central.
South Eddie, show is going. South Eddie, show is going.
Right,
Unless you guys are cutting each other off.
Which one injured? Which one injured? We've gone northbound through Times Square. There's numerous people.
Starship, start up the traffic. 16th Avenue, westbound on 44, 5 and 7. Going into it.
David, going.
Task force. You let the arrive alive.
4, 3, and 7 in regards to multiple people injured at this time.
Once arrested and booked, authorities would identify him as Richard Rojas. Richard Rojas was a man who lived in the Bronx and a military veteran who served in the U.S. Navy. He was enlisted in the Navy from 2011 to 2014. In 2014, he was discharged. His family reported that his mental health had declined after he came back from the Navy. He always had mental health problems, even as a child, but he never sought out treatment for his mental health problems. Friends and family members reported that he had developed alcohol and drug abuse problems. He began abusing drugs and alcohol, which only exacerbated his mental health problems and led to him becoming more paranoid and hostile. His friends also reported that he posted weird and demonic content on his social media, along with having an obsession with Scientology. He admitted to police that he had no memory of what happened or what he did. He was scheduled to meet with a mental health counselor from the Veterans Affairs Center on May 22nd. He had a previous arrest in 2012. He was arrested after attacking a cab driver and also yelling threats of harm towards police officers, saying, "My life is over, I don't care." His second arrest was a week before him running over people at Times Square, where he put a knife to the neck of a man he accused of stealing his identity. He also had 2 previous DUIs. In the aftermath of the attack, the mayor at the time, Bill de Blasio, came out and said there was no evidence that the attack was an act of terrorism. When Rojas was taken into custody, law enforcement officers performed a blood test to see if there was any alcohol or drugs in his system. The alcohol test came back negative, but the drug test came back positive. He had drugs in his system during the attack. Specifically, he had synthetic marijuana and PCP, more commonly known as angel dust. In his police interrogation, he seems to be rambling and behaving abnormally. He mentions that voices told him it was the last day on Earth and that nothing mattered. Also, he heard voices telling him that the police were going to kill him, so he mentions that he wanted to die via suicide by cop. Lastly, throughout the interrogation, he mentions that God told him to do the attack. Rojas would be charged with second-degree murder, 20 counts of attempted murder, and 5 counts of aggravated vehicular homicide. Rojas, along with his lawyer, pleaded not guilty. After months of examining his notebooks and other possessions, his lawyer filed a motion to pursue the insanity defense. The insanity defense is very controversial. However, the most important factor about the insanity defense is that it is very rare for someone to actually be found not guilty due to insanity. Less than 1% of people who are arrested and trialed plead not guilty due to insanity, and only a quarter of those 1% actually end up with the defendant being found not guilty due to insanity. This is because the burden of proof is on the defendant, not the prosecutor, which is the opposite of a normal court case. It is also very important for the courts to be able to tell the difference between someone struggling with mental illness and someone who is deemed to be insane, because to some extent everyone struggles with mental illness, but only a small percentage of the population is insane. It also depends on the state and the jurisdiction that a person is in that can affect the definition of legal insanity. However, in New York, the Penal Code says, New York Law Penal Law 40.15, relieves a defendant of criminal responsibility if, generally speaking, due to mental disease or defect, the defendant lacked the capacity to know or understand the meaning and severity of their own acts and lacked the ability to know or understand that the acts were improper. In New York, where this crime was committed, the insanity defense is very special because it has unique procedures such as having to submit a medical examination before the trial and losing patient-psychiatrist-client privilege. Anything you say or do to a psychiatrist can be used as evidence in a court of law. The criteria for someone to be considered insane is 1. The defendant has to be severely mentally ill enough in order for them not to know what they were doing at the time of the crime was illegal. 2. The defendant was severely mentally ill enough that they did not know what they were doing at the time of the crime was morally wrong. 3. The defendant was compelled to do a certain action by an irresistible force. The reason someone who is being tried would be found not guilty due to insanity is that one of the core values of the American justice system is intent. You have to intentionally commit a crime in order to be found guilty of it. The central concept of someone being found not guilty due to insanity is that someone's mental illness can be so severe that it clouds their judgment, and they do not know what is real or not. This is the core principle of this defense. The defendant did not know what reality was. Someone cannot be found guilty of a crime they did not intend on doing. This is very significant because the defendant has to show the jury enough information to convince them that the defendant was actually insane. Most people are skeptical when it comes to believing that someone is actually insane. However, in this case, the defendant proved that. While most of the court hearings and transcripts remain private, so we do not know all the evidence that the defense provided in order to prove insanity, one that we do know is Dr. Ziv Cohen, who is the psychiatrist that testified that Rojas had schizophrenia, which is a brain disease that affects the way people see reality. Dr. Ziv Cohen testified, saying, on that day of the rampage, his imaginary guide told Rojas he needed to crash his car into spirits around him in order to send them to heaven and release Rojas from the torture that he is experiencing as part of his psychosis. Secondly, the defense relied on testimony from his family members, such as his uncle and brother, testifying on how much his mental health had deteriorated since he was discharged from the Navy. His brother testified saying that he became increasingly paranoid about anything and everyone. He would put tape on every screen, such as phone screen, computer screen, and TV screen, because he thought someone was watching him. His brother testified that he thought random people walking down the street were following him, and he also looked for things that weren't there. The prosecution mainly relied on witness testimony from the events that unfolded on that day. People who saw what Rojas did or victims of what Rojas did. Julie Elsman was a victim who took the stand. She and both of her daughters were run over by Rojas. One of her daughters, 13-year-old Ava, suffered broken ribs, a collapsed lung, and a leg fracture. But worst of all, her other daughter was killed by Rojas, 18-year-old Alyssa. In the end, considering all these factors, the jury decided on July 22, 2022, that Richard Rojas was not guilty due to insanity. Now that Richard Rojas was found not guilty due to insanity, we have to ask ourselves, what now? For now, instead of going to jail, Rojas will be sent to a psychiatric facility. A psychiatric facility is different from being sent to prison. First of all, it is different because there is no date of release. The patient will be released when the doctor has determined that the patient is mentally sane and not a threat to themselves or others, which could be in a few months, few years, or never. Second, they will also need to prove that they are mentally sane by going to sanity hearings that take place in mental health courts in order to be released. Is this the future that awaits Rojas? Is it justice? To some, yes, because if Rojas was found guilty, he would have to spend the rest of his life behind bars, but now he will get the help he deserves. But for others, it was all an act. Richard Rojas knew what he was doing when he began his rampage. Thomas Elsman, father of Alyssa, said the verdict was disappointing as Rojas didn't deserve any treatment, but rather he should be punished for what he did. And as always, thank you for watching.